Ideally, I would like to see over the years more interest in achieving some degree of stability in exchange rates, which probably, as a practical matter, means between Europe and the dollar, and now, eventually anyway, the RMB. We'll get the yen in there too, I guess. The odds on that happening anytime don't seem to be very high at the moment. So I talk about it from time to time, but I've done that through a number of decades. Every time I think there's some grounds for restoring some sense, because you get the exchange rates really out of line, as probably is happening now to some extent. But it is very hard to get governments to cooperate when it comes to the point they have to do something about domestic policy. It's not just a question of wishing that the exchange rates were more stable. What are you going to do to stabilize them? And what is the appropriate level to start with? And there's enough disagreement on that point that we haven't made much progress. You're going to have to allow the exchange rate to be an important influence on monetary policy, and how many countries are really willing to do that now. In the old days, in the gold standard, we did it, and to some extent we did it with Bretton Woods, but you have the additional complication now of capital flows being so much more important, and unless you want to restore more general use of capital controls, the burden on monetary policy in particular becomes pretty great. You know, it wasn't so long ago, how many years ago, quite a few years ago, you had the International Monetary Conference was in Hong Kong, I guess, and the IMF was willing to take the position we ought to abandon all controls on capital requirements. Then the Asian crisis had come along, and that didn't seem like such a great idea. But in fact, in these markets, capital controls are hard to develop and enforce in a way that makes sense too. So we fall back on not the laziest solution, I guess, but what always seems politically the easiest solution is to let the exchange rate fluctuate. To a degree, that's okay, but how do you prevent it from getting out of bounds? I grew up in the United States Treasury, dedicated, people don't remember it quite this way, but dedicated to defending the stability of the dollar against other major currencies. That was at the heart of the Bretton Woods system. And a feeling the United States itself, because of its role in the world, had no capacity to take any initiative on its exchange rate anyway, because other people adjusted to you. You couldn't adjust to them. We tried very hard in the 50s, 60s to maintain that. I myself came to the conclusion by the early 70s that this game was over. Sooner or later, the disequilibrium had become great enough so that we had to get some kind of rearrangement of the monetary system. We suspended gold payments, as I saw a step in that direction, but we never followed up on the step. I remember that I was quite fearful when we went off gold. Well, I did want to negotiate a sizable change in exchange rates, that it might get out of hand. And it pretty promptly did get out of hand. And it was a good example of the problems you can run into when you had a very violent exchange rate movements and contributed to the economic stagflation and inflation and stagflation. And I think it's a complicating problem in economic policy for a decade or more. Well, there were efforts late in the 1970s, occasional efforts to stabilize the system, a pretty sizable effort to achieve some stabilization at the end of the Carter administration. That was not at all favored by the new Republican administration. It was very anti-worrying about exchange rates until the dollar got very high, and Mr. Baker certainly took the lead in developing an approach not to stabilize the dollar at that point, but to devalue the dollar relative to other currencies, but could be taken, and that and the subsequent so-called Louvre agreement These were the last real efforts were made to achieve some kind of international coordination with exchange rate policy. And those efforts are kind of fallen by the wayside, I'm sorry to say. You know, Bob Mandela is worried about the problem of exchange rates throughout his career. And you can take the situation prior to the great financial crisis where the United States was running a big deficit, easily financed by the Chinese who were running a big surplus, that it was very easy for us to have very comfortable, easy monetary policies, and which helped to feed eventually the housing problem, which in turn led to a great financial debacle. Now, whether better management of the exchange rate so that the United States would have had a lesser deficit and China would have had a lesser surplus, yeah, looking back, certainly that would have been nice, but were either country willing to do that? And how do you get the political understanding and the economic understanding that in that circumstance it would have been useful for China and the United States to take action to achieve a better exchange rate relationship? I think you're having a conference to try to keep the candle lit a little bit here, so I appreciate that, and I think it's a good idea. I'm glad somebody is. You know, the speech I wrote recently about a new Bretton Woods, and I was skeptical enough, so I made the title of New Bretton Woods with 5 question marks after it. You can knock off those question marks one by one. You can knock off one of them in this conference. Well, it's a particularly confusing situation now because you haven't got any coherence in Europe, in the sense that you have, there are enough problems internal to the Eurozone that they are hardly in a position to give priority to managing the euro internationally when they're having trouble enough managing it internally. So that is one example of the things that impede these agreements. Maybe the level of the euro, somewhat depressed, seems desirable from the European standpoint right now. But is the level of the dollar desirable from the American standpoint right now? And you would think we would be able to do better than that. Wouldn't it be nice so that those swings instead of 20% were 10%? Wouldn't that give us some flexibility that may be necessary, but avoid the extremes that seem destructive? You have to get some international agreement on various indicators of when the disequilibrium in economies is reflected in exchange rates that are not helpful over time. It's hard. I'm not sure this administration has at all thought through the problems and the potential and what practical steps are really possible over time and what steps might encourage any interest on the part of our trading partners or what are you going to do in Mexico? Here's an easy question. This is a simple bilateral exchange rate. Reasons related or unrelated to, partly unrelated to economic differences. All this talk about trade with Mexico, what's the implication for the exchange rate, or what should be the implication for the exchange rate? Is there a reasonable policy in the exchange rate between the peso, the Canadian dollar, and the U.S. dollar? They both all have had pretty big swings.
So maybe start
at home. That should be a lot easier. You could argue that as part of a free trade agreement. I don't know if we're going to still have a free trade agreement. Assuming we do, we ought to have some understanding about exchange rates, that the exchange rate fluctuation itself doesn't upset the inherent advantage of the free trade agreement in having competitive trade throughout the area, fair and competitive trade throughout the area. Actually, that would not be I think it'd be an interesting point of departure. One that hadn't worked in the past, I might say, but try again. I knew Kemp some. I didn't know him well, but we would see each other once in a while. I didn't agree with all his supply side enthusiasm, but he was he was concerned about thinking about these things in a way that was looking for solutions. And he was not of a totally closed mind by any means. And he had an open personality. He was a man who wanted to reach agreement. He wanted to do right. You weren't an enemy if you didn't agree with him. And I'm sorry he's not around. I think he would be a breath of fresh air now. Bob Mundell is much more of an intellectual, obviously. He had far-reaching ideas and a following, and Mundell, had a kind of prestige in the profession and an interest in these things. And most people with prestige in the inflation don't have much interest in these things, or are not advocates. So he is one of a fairly limited crew. It's important that he's there, and his presence is notable.